Okay, thanks everybody. This is part of our celebrating Audubon's legacy today. And we're very, very proud to have with us a friend of the Art Guild, an artist himself, and a researcher. And Jim Baker was the head of the Felix Valley Historic Site for some 28 years. And he was also, I believe, the president of the board of this museum when it was a museum.
Friends of the museum.
Yeah, Friends of the Museum in, I don't know how, 15 years, something like that. Anyway, he's no stranger to this place, or a stranger to us, so I probably don't have to introduce him because I think you all know him. But thank you very much for coming, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I think the concept of what we're doing this weekend is really wonderful, and I'm delighted to be a part of it. I owe big thanks to Carolyn Bach, who got me to sit on that sofa over there about 4 months ago and presented me with a fascinating bag of books about Audubon. And she's just doing one of these. And I got the message. And actually, I'm not surprised, because the members of the Art Guild deserve accolades far beyond what we can give them, because they are a determined bunch. People would have said, you can't turn this building into a wonderful art center, but they did. You can't have exhibits that change and bring people into town, but they do. It's a real valuable resource here in St. Genevieve, and I think we're extraordinarily lucky to have people like this and resources like this, which make a huge difference in how we can enjoy the community. And I've found that through all these years I've been here, St. Genevieve is, and all of you native folks know this, it took us interlopers a little while to figure out, but this is a wonderful place. And it doesn't matter what you're interested in, be it art or history or architecture or tourism, there's something for you here. And the deeper that you dig into St. Genevieve, the more you're going to discover, and the more you know you have to get a bigger shovel, because there's lots and lots to discover. So I've discovered a lot myself in the last couple months working on this project. And so I first want to also thank Bill Nager for his marvelous photography and reprographic skills here. So I feel that we're lucky to be sitting here surrounded by these beautiful pieces of art. And so the story kind of goes back to those two portraits, the portraits of Ferdinand Rozier and his wife, Constance Rozier. And so the idea was, yes, they're in the Missouri Historical Society collection. They're lovely. They're two of our founding, not quite founding fathers, but pretty close to founding fathers here in St. Genevieve. So we just really don't know much about them. And there have been a lot of things suggested about those paintings. So my task was to kind of dive a little deeper into that story. So that's what I've done. I've talked to a few of my buddies, my friends, about kind of the way I wanted to unravel this story for you. And ordinarily, people like me, math people and historian people, we kind of mesh together in a few places. But when we tell stories about history, it's very common for us to start at the very beginning and just move in very definite increments along the line in chronological order. But I decided that maybe in this one case, you'll bear with me, I'm going to try and do it a little bit differently, more to kind of reveal what I found out in the order of things that I found out. How does that sound? So bear with me. If you get confused about what century we're in, just raise your hand. We'll fix it. So I thought for myself, the very first thing I needed to do was to be in contact with the Missouri Historical Society, which Carolyn already had been. I emailed the very nice curator up there and explained what I was doing and said, could I please come up and see the paintings, the portraits of the Rogers. Oh, that was just fine. So I made the appointment finally and got up there on short notice when she was available. So at the Missouri Historical Society, the exhibits are in one place, but the really good stuff that's behind the scenes is in another place. So they took me into this other place. And it's huge, and they have all sorts of very fascinating bits and pieces of everything. So, but I got escorted in there and got to the place where these portraits were. And so they're on a big rack. It's made out of like a material that would look like fence. And they slide these racks out. So it slides out into the middle of the room, and it's 20 feet of paintings hung on both sides. Pretty standard for museum storage. But when your eye is caught by those portraits, you know you've been caught, because they are truly magnificent portraits. They're in their original gold frames. They're maybe just a little larger than that, but they're fantastic portraits. And, you know, I could tell my heart was beating a little faster because I love that kind of stuff. So I got to look them over and really get a close-up appreciation of those paintings. The thing that I didn't get to do, which the historian part of me wanted to do, but I know that I didn't want to be kicked out. The backs of those paintings are covered to protect the painting. It's covered with foam core board, just screwed in or something. It's just so something doesn't accidentally whack the painting from behind and poke a hole through it. So what I wanted to do was really examine the stretcher and how that was attached, how the stretcher was braced, all those kind of little minute details about portraits and paintings that were done in the 19th century, just to see the thing. Was a little hamstrung. I got to see the real things, and that was very important for me, and I had to kind of suck it up and let the rest of it go. The curator was very, very nice to me and allowed me, to soak that in for quite a while. So I appreciated the chance. Then I went back to the reading room at Missouri Historical Society, and I asked for something, if they would share with me. When in museum work, you get an artifact donated, like we get something donated to the Felix Valet House, we would create something called an accession file, which is the file of documents and papers and anything that came with that piece. And so I kind of asked that question, and she was, again, very generous and brought me a big, thick file on these paintings. So that's how our next step comes into being. You can see how really glorious they are in the gold frames. They're really lovely pieces. And in fact, we have a pair in the Felix Valet House of Jean-Baptiste and Marie-Jeanne Barbeau that are not the originals either, because they're still in the home of a descendant. But the frames are almost, I'd say, dead ringers for those frames of those two portraits. Wonderful stuff. So Ferdinand, 1777, 1864, and Constance, 1795, over near Prairie du Rocher, born and died here in St. Genevieve in 1878. So the first thing that actually caught my eye when I looked at the paintings was this. It was attached to the bottom of the frame, and I had to look it up on the internet, but do you remember in the 1970s when you wanted to make a label? You had this little red gun, and you would turn the dial and make an A, turn the dial and make a C, turn the dial, and then you would peel the tape off the back and stick it. Somebody has done that to this piece, which I guess kind of disturbed me, because in museum world, you probably don't want to do that. But somebody did it up there. And the other thing that surprised me is we know somebody did it there, but nobody's taken it off either. So anyway, I don't know. I have a little hard time in judging. Can you all see very well? You see what it says? No, it says Ferdinand Roger there, and it says artist unknown, gift Joseph Deloge. So if you're into the Audubon and Rozier story, you know that Rozier came here as a fairly young man, stayed, and he founded this real business empire. His wife had a son over in France. She wanted Firmin Deloge, her son, to come and be with his uncle here in St. Genevieve or in this area. That's what they did. They sent Firmin over here, and he got set up in business over west of here starting out. He kind of had a great empire himself, and the Deloge family now is one of the leading generous benefactor families in St. Louis, and a lot due to Joe Deloge. So I thought, okay, it makes sense, perhaps, that these portraits of the Roziers ended up in Joe Deloge's family, and Joe Deloge then gave those portraits to the Missouri Historical Society. That seemed logical to me. It's not true, but it's very logical. That's not the way it happened. So the more I went through trying to figure out, because where the things, their history, the provenance, tells you a lot about what's happened to those portraits through time. So I'm thinking, okay, they were at Joe Deloge's, but not really. So back to this file, and this is a copy of that accession record. And these two portraits went to the Missouri Historical Society all the way back in 1955. They were donated. The trick was they needed some money because they bought these portraits. The Missouri Historical Society purchased these portraits for a whopping $400 plus shipping. Joe Deloge, pardon me?
A piece or both?
No, for both. No, actually, for 3 paintings. Joe Deloge paid that money. That's how it's a gift of Joe Deloge, but not really. So I'm looking through these papers, and then this jumps out at me. Associated names, Mr. and Mrs. Felix Valley Mahoney. Okay, Felix Valley Mahoney. And so then I started looking back through the file, and there's lots of letters. And here's the first one that caught my eye. It's all the way back from 1941. You probably can't read much, but I've highlighted and expanded the important section. It says, gentlemen. She's writing the Missouri Historical Society. I have in my home 2 framed portraits of my grandparents, Ferdinand Rozier and Constance Roy, his wife. Marvelous. She wants to give them to the society because she wants them preserved. Good old Odile Valley Mahoney. Who is Odile Valley Mahoney? That's very strange. Well, unfortunately, Odile Valley Mahoney died in 1943, which kind of messed things up. This is a letter because the curator, you have to understand, there's no email. If you want to call to California, you better be ready to pay for your call to California, all that stuff. So they wrote letters back and forth. Wrote letters back and forth, just like the real world. Here's a letter that was written after Mrs. Mahoney's death because the curator had written out there. And she says, the 3 paintings you have reference to are in the hands of her only son, Felix Valley Mahoney, who cannot be induced to part with them. In this connection, having been cognizant. Well, and they go on. But anyway, this is 1947. Odile had passed away in 1943. So the son has the things. Did you see where this is written to? Hollywood, California. Felix Valley Mahoney, Odile Valley Mahoney in Hollywood, California. This is just kind of a strange twist. So then, along the line, the Missouri Historical Society and the director at the time, Charles Van Ravensway, a very big personality and a very big influence on history in the state of Missouri, pushed. Here's the telegram. It's in 1955. They've been negotiating all this time trying to get Felix Valley Mahoney to play ball. He won't do it. Now he's in bad enough financial shape, he's agreed to sell the paintings. So Anne Andre Clark was a friend of Van Ravensway's. She was out there. She went out to see him personally and made the deal. So this is where the $400 comes in. But if you read closely, you're going to see 3 oil paintings in perfect condition. 1, 2. When I read this and figured out what they were talking about, I just flipped. You know what the 3rd oil painting is? You remember the diorama that the Felix Valley House made? Lots of it was based on this little painting like this, that panoramic painting of St. Genevieve from 1850. That was the 3rd painting. It's just, you can't, I couldn't make it up. I couldn't make it up. Yes, Bill?
The one that's attributed to Ray, Conrad Ray,
Yep.
was that the painting?
Yep,
Okay.
yep, yep.
I didn't just steal some wind and say it, did I?
I wouldn't have answered. No. So they are working to buy the painting. So now I'm up there and I'm thinking, Felix Valley Mahoney, Odile Valley Mahoney. This is just too funny. There's got to be a connection. These are not random people. And indeed, they are not random people. So the top line, Ferdinand Roger and his wife Constance, they had 10 children. Felix Roger was one of their sons, and you all know where the Inn Saint Jean Beauvais is now. That was eventually the Felix Roger home. That was his home. He had 11 children. A young lady named Odile, we assume named for Odile Valley, was the youngest of those children. She was born in 1868. And that is our Odile Valley Mahoney. So she married James Mahoney, who was here in St. Genevieve as a teacher and a couple other things. And they married their son. What else would you name your son but Felix Valley Mahoney? There he is. He was born in 1898. So indeed, she was the granddaughter of Ferdinand and Constance Roger. And they moved to California in 1916. Believe it or not, Felix Valley Mahoney was a protege of a movie star named Fatty Arbuckle. He was well known in silent pictures. He was a big guy, a big character. He was a big guy and he was a big character. That's how they're out there, out in California, out in Hollywood with this. So the more I thought about this, I thought, how did Odile Mahoney end up with the painting herself? But you have to kind of reverse the clock a little bit and think about this. The youngest of 11 children. My guess is that maybe those paintings had been in her parents' house. And as the kids grow up and get married, get out of the house, she's the last one on the list. I don't know when they ended up breaking up housekeeping, but 1908 is when her father died. 1890 is when her mother died. So by this point, by 1916, the parents are gone. It does make sense to me that maybe that is how Odile Valley Mahoney ended up with those 2 portraits out to California. So there we go. Purchased and shipped back to St. Louis in 1955. Charles Van Ravensway knew everybody and knew the Rogers here in St. Genevieve. At the last minute in this deal, there was some confusion because somebody said, no, we're buying portraits of Jean-Baptiste Vallet and his wife. And somebody else said, no, it's the Rogers. And they went, well, who are they? And so then he wanted to make sure he had the right people. And he contacted the Rogers. It wasn't Henry L. Roger, but it was Francis Roger at the Henry L. Roger Bank, wrote back and said, yes, I'll come up and see him, but I don't remember anything about these portraits. So that adds a little twist to it as well. But eventually, enough Rogers got in contact with him and said, yes, we can see the Roger face in Ferdinand there, and the Roger hairline, all that business. So they did indeed confirm it. And then when you look back at the letter from Odile herself, she says, my grandparents. So those are the Rogers.
It, it's interesting when you look at and you see faces. I can even see in Constance Roy that some of the Rozier kids that we know today.
Sure.
You know.
Yep. It's fascinating. So now is where we're going to jump backwards now. We're up to 1959 or 55. So this story isn't on a single trajectory, you know, like some stories go from beginning to end. These stories of Audubon and the stories of Rozier, they do a lot of this, going around. And they do intertwine. And of course, we all know that they intertwined here in St. Genevieve with the business partnership. But then after the dissolution of the business partnership, they go their separate ways, but not completely. They have contact with each other. They see each other a number of other times during the rest of their lives. And that's some of these waves that come in and go back and forth. So we're going to kind of try and get you caught up with both guys right about the same time. What I mean by that is Rozier, I think, probably had this on his mind back in 1811, and he may have even seen this young lady walking around town whose name was Constance Roy, and she was a relative of the Valet family. Her aunt was Madame Guibord. Her aunt was Mrs. Jean-Baptiste Valet. Her aunts were part of the Barbeau family, and there were 5 very influential young ladies who married 5 very influential young men. She's part of that group. So, if Rozier was looking for a young wife, and she was considerably younger than he was, if he was looking for a young wife, he found a great candidate, well-connected in St. Genevieve, what he was looking for, French-speaking. He was in a place, I think, where he felt very much at home. And Constance Roy then becomes part of that next chapter in his life. So their home was just up Merchant Street, and unfortunately no longer standing today. But y'all remember the 2-story kind of American square brick house. It used to be Lucretia's a long time ago, and it's had a couple of different incarnations. That's where that house stood. But this is the house. It was built by Jacob Philipson, the man who built the Felix Valet house. And you can see he intended this one for business too. You can see the 2 front separate doors. The staircases are not there anymore because that kind of had gone out of favor. But that's the house, and that's where Rozier started his business there and his family together. So same idea as the Felix Valet house. So that was going on. They got married August 18th, 1813, and she started having children. And they end up with 10 kids. So it's quite a large family. The other thing that I want to point out to you is if you want to judge a little bit, in retrospect, there's an artifact here. That is a magnificent silver pitcher. And it has the initials CR on it, which stand for Constance Roy. It was made right here in St. Genevieve by Antoine O'Neill, the house on Main Street, South Main, that's been restored. That was the original silversmith's, that was his home there, his business. That is such an important piece in American history. It's in the Yale Art Museum. That little piece from St. Genevieve. I suspect that was a gift from Ferdinand Rozier to his lovely wife, or maybe she went down and picked it out herself. But I think that really, it says volumes about St. Genevieve, but it also says by 1820 or 21, when O'Neill was here in St. Genevieve, they were wealthy enough people to afford something like that. You know, most people were not drinking out of a silver urn like that. This says a lot about their financial status and how well he had done in those first 7 or 8 years being here in St. Genevieve. So his trajectory is, you know, a little more upwards in terms of financial success. But anyway, let's turn to our other friend sitting in the audience. I heard this term a long time ago when I first got to know Roscoe Misselhorn, and I first got to know Betty Garrity, and she started telling me the stories of Matt Ziegler. And they had this term that all those artists used this term in that kind of era. They called things pot boilers. So small works of art, quick works of art, all those things were knockout pieces for these artists because they knew something small would sell. It brought in a little revenue, and it essentially kept the pot boiling. Audubon used that same term at one time for this. So he's all this time working on birds, and I thought, today we may talk about Audubon for quite a while and not mention the word birds, but we can't do it. So that was his focus, his love, his passion. But he had a wife and 2 or 3 children at different times to support. His wife was, if anyone was ever a saint, she's a saint. She had to endure a lot more than most women, even at that time, would have put up with. But I think she recognized the genius, and that was her mission in her life, was to support that genius. So these are sketches, portraits that he did, and he could do them without much time involved. His skill was improving and improving and improving, and he could charge $20 or $25 for these. Now, if you find one today and the price tag is still only $25, my recommendation is you just get it. He knew these people, and one of the places that, of course, Audubon had been was the town that Rozier and Audubon left in Kentucky, a little place called Henderson. And after Audubon left here, he went back to Henderson where his wife was waiting for him. He gets in business with his brother-in-law. They start all these commercial ventures. They start by constructing a steam mill, which was an absolute unmitigated disaster. And by this time, 1819, they left Henderson because they were broke. They had no other choice. So he goes on to Louisville, and I think this is a wonderful quote. He said, "I at once undertook to take portraits of the human head divine in black chalk, and thanks to my master David, succeeded admirably. I commenced at exceedingly low prices, but I raised these prices as I became more known in this capacity." He did all sorts of portraits just to keep things going. People got to know him, and this is a morbid way to discuss things, but if a loved one passed away without having a portrait, they at different times called him in to do a portrait of their loved one, even though they had already passed away. And so these are kind of some of the earliest ones. There were literally hundreds of these, but not that many have survived. But you see, and I want you to notice just a couple things about those. They're mostly done in very strict profile, and they're fairly flat in relief, not a lot of relief. The backgrounds are fairly simple yet, very, very flat and simple. This one I just found, and I think it's a remarkable portrait. Look at this guy. You can just about feel him and his little hand coming out to grasp yours. This is again in 1819 in Louisville, and that's where he kind of went to regroup, and he found a lot of success right away in these portraits in Louisville. And so he continued on. But this guy, Henri de Galland, here's 2 more. Again, profile, fairly straightforward, simple portraits. These are done in chalk, charcoal, some graphite, multiple media. At one point, he kind of runs out of a good crowd of people looking for portraits. He decides then he has an opportunity to go and work in Cincinnati. And so he leaves here and heads to Cincinnati in about 1820. He starts to work for a museum there in Cincinnati, the Western Museum. Ostensibly, his task was to, prepare and stuff birds for display. And so that's kind of the job he worked on at that point. He got to know several other people affiliated and working with the museum. Aaron Houghton Corwine was really a pretty well-known young man. He ended up being a marvelous portrait artist, but Audubon did his portrait. These two are two other people who were, the husband was affiliated with the museum as well. So now if you're looking with just the pencil sketch here, there's a lot of detail that shows up in that portrait of Aaron Corwine up there. The ruffles, the coat, all those details. And you begin to see that as well with this woman. And the painting is not strictly a profile painting. It's beginning to be a three-quarter, and you begin to see how he uses that. This is a wonderful one as well, done at the museum in August of 1820. And you can see it. He was good enough to sign this one. It says, drawn by John J. Audubon, August 1821, the Western Museum. That's the name of the museum there in Cincinnati. This is John Cleves Sims. So again, that pose now is rotating a little. You pick up more detail, you pick up more relief. Those images are taking on life. And I think this was a time period when what he was doing was being perfected. These portraits were being perfected. This is one of the very earliest oil paintings by Audubon that we know about. This is another gentleman, an Englishman, who worked at the museum right at the very same time, but about 1820. This is oil on board. It's fairly small, 21, almost 22 by 19 inches. So it's not the biggest portrait. But again, you can see the brushwork here for his vest, and all the brushwork around his collar and the necktie are part of that. 1820. And this is his brother-in-law. Also, this is the point at which, and I'm missing out on reading some of my notes to you. After in Cincinnati working for a while, they had kind of completed what they needed to do for the museum. And Audubon ran into this problem over and over and over. He had agreed to work and do all this work, and then the museum didn't pay him what they actually promised him at the beginning. And if you find a recurring theme in Audubon's life, that's one of it. You know, he gets into a position which he thinks is going to be the solution financially. It works for a little bit, but then, you know, people renege on the deal, people don't pay, all those troubles that he gets into. That's part of that story. But Lucy Bakewell was from an affluent family they were English, but in Philadelphia, outside of Philadelphia, where this Mill Grove was, where the property was that Audubon's father owned. That's how he initially met Lucy Audubon. They were smitten with each other and waited years and years and years to get married. He felt as though he had to go back to France and ask for his father's permission to marry her. Plus, Lucy Bakewell's father didn't think a whole lot of Audubon because he thought, this guy doesn't have a job. So that's it. But this is his brother, and eventually her brother. They were in business together too. This one is a little curious. It says on it, the Marquis de Lafayette, 1820. Oh, how exciting is that? You all know that the Marquis de Lafayette was a famous Frenchman who participated in the American Revolution, was a good pal of George Washington's. He was present at some of the most pivotal points in the battles on the East Coast for the American Revolution, and he represented the assistance that France gave to the fledgling United States. But he wasn't here in 1820. He came to the United States as an old man like that on quite a grand tour, but it wasn't until 1824 or 25. This particular image, the drawing, was shown at an exhibit in the 1930s to commemorate 100 years of something for Audubon. And that's the last time that sketch is known. The only thing they have left of that sketch is the photograph that they took during the exhibit. And it was labeled like this, but we really, you know, certainly Audubon did it, but it's probably not the Marquis de Lafayette. the time frame doesn't work out correctly. A few more portraits. You can see again, some going back to the profile but look at the magical detail that you see on her cap and the shawl and the coat. These are now the littles that you have over here in this thing, which you can see maybe in a little better view from there. But there again, the faces are slightly turned, so it's that three-quarter view. By October, John James Audubon had done his work in Cincinnati, had left there, and he started a new journal. And this journal covers the trip down the Ohio, down the Mississippi River, and all the way down to New Orleans. And that's that journal is one that has survived. Unfortunately, the journals that we read about in the published books today, those journals have been edited by his granddaughter. And so we're getting a little bit of maybe of a sanitized version of his life. But this one escaped that editing, and it also escaped being burned and destroyed. So it's a wonderful document. It's a great piece. They are headed down by flatboat to New Orleans. They actually stop in Natchez on the 26th of December in 1821 and stay there for a few days. And then they leave from there for New Orleans on the 31st of December in 1820, and they get to New Orleans on January the 7th. So it gives you a little idea of, the travel. They meet up with people along the way. They stay. Audubon takes advantage of this time to go out on these hunting forays off sides of the river and collect specimens. So it's all part of his process in collecting birds to draw and drawing birds. But they get down there, and then our next friend comes into the story. This is Jean-Baptiste Bozier, who was here in St. Genevieve and married into the Moreau family. He was originally a native of New Orleans and came up here and met Martha Moreau, and they were married. He had a store right there on Merchant Street where the Shaw House is today. So this is fairly well documented because, like many other of his portraits, Audubon mentions this in his diary. So not only do we have the portrait, which I must say is in the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, and we have it beautifully reproduced here. But this was on the 28th of April, and Audubon went down to the docks. I think this was maybe his usual practice, and found people who were interested in portraits. There was a steamboat down there called the Hecla, and who other than Jean-Baptiste Bozier was on the Hecla that day, who sat for his portrait. So I think this portrait is one of the pinnacle ones of that whole genre of portraits in charcoal, pencil, graphite. When you see this reproduction of it is okay. But when you see the one we have at the Felix Valley House, it's a little better. But I have to back up and say, quite a number of years ago, I called up the Nelson Atkins Museum and said, could I see this? And they let me. And they took me back into another room in Kansas City with locks on the doors. And I got to see this in person. So you can't imagine, it was a thrill to see it in person because of what it is. But what is lost in the subsequent reproductions that we go through to see it here on a screen today, the portrait is still as crisp and gorgeous, just gorgeous as it was, I think, the day he did it. It's remarkable. But he continued on with this process, and by this time now, Audubon is back in New Orleans. So his wife and kids are not there. His wife and kids are not there, and this is the spring. So he's always on the lookout for what his next job is going to be, and he picked out a great place to have his next job. He met this family down in New Orleans, the Peary family, very well-to-do planters in Louisiana. They invited him to come and live with them on their plantation, and he was going to be a tutor for their daughter because he taught math, he taught writing, he taught art, all sorts of art. And so a young lady needed to be well versed in those subjects. They said, we're going to make a deal. You'll be responsible for teaching our daughter half of the time. The other half of the day is yours. It's free. And that is the area in which many, many, many of the birds in the Birds of America came from, because he hired a gentleman, and I think Mr. Mason was with him, who would go out and they would get samples. He would pay people for samples. That's where a lot of this primary work was done with the species of birds in that part of Louisiana. So it's at this wonderful house, which is still in existence today. And I've never been there, but now it's right on the top of my list for what I need to see in Louisiana. It's a wonderful place. It's a beautiful house. State historic site, even better. But once again, things did not quite go to Audubon's plan. Mrs. Peary, the mother, was kind of, I'm getting the impression, a little cranky, maybe fidgety. So the young lady gets sick. The daughter, Eliza, is sick, and really sick, in bed sick, for quite a number of weeks. And so the doctor says, no more art lessons for you. So Audubon is there, living at the house, being fed, all that stuff. And so at a certain point then, the mother is unhappy because she doesn't want him around anymore. So Audubon says, okay, he writes out his bill of what they owe him. However, he includes all those days that he would have been tutoring the daughter, and he didn't get to tutor the daughter because he felt it wasn't his fault that she was sick. The mother took off on that one. She didn't appreciate that. And so they had a big fight, and she said, get out, and which I guess they were prepared to do. But then Audubon took the bill to the husband, and he was a little more congenial, but it ended up that he did not get paid what he thought he was really owed for that whole time. Unfortunate. He came in June 18th, 1821, and finally he got fired on October the 5th in 1821, and he heads back downriver to New Orleans, and by December 18th of 1821, he's finally saved up enough money, which he has sent along the way back to his wife, and he asks her to come by steamboat or boat down the river, which she does. And it's quite a happy reunion by that time because they'd been separated for a long, long time. So it was a happy thing. But they're back together now in New Orleans. Here's another portrait. And in his journal, he oftentimes makes mention of doing a portrait of the captain of the boat. And it wasn't just because he wanted to say, oh gosh, I've got all these portraits of captains of boats. No, he did that in exchange for his fare. So this is one of those captains along the line. They actually end up renting a little house for themselves in New Orleans. And it's on Dauphin Street. On the left side is from his journal, this 1820, 1821 journal that has survived. So this is where our paths now cross again. Mr. Rozier was here in business, but periodically he needed to go down to New Orleans to conduct his trade business down there. So he is down there on business, happens to be on New Year's Eve, or Christmas Eve, excuse me, in 1821, and he spends the evening with the Audubons. So it's a remarkable reconnection of those two gentlemen. He's very matter-of-fact about things. He says, weather very cold. Mr. Rozier came to pay us a visit. It is 11 years since he and I and my family were all together. Oh, so that's kind of a charming thing. Okay, now let's jump back to 2022. So here I am sitting at the desk in the Missouri Historical Society in the reading room. So all these archival collections, magnificent things there. And I pull out the Rozier collection, which is a collection of manuscript papers from the Roziers. And I'm going through and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, look at this, look at this, look at this, look at this. So you ask to be brought those documents and they bring them out in folders and stuff. I got to say two things. Ferdinand Roger had excellent handwriting for the 1820s, and his French was amazing. My French is not at all good, but I'm used to reading some of the documents from around here where the grammar is kind of shaky and the handwriting is horrible. You could tell he had been well educated in his youth because he had beautiful handwriting. So, that being said, you're going to see this next slide and you're going to say, well, Jim, you are absolutely nuts. No wonder you can read it. It's written on a typewriter. But let me pause that before you make too many judgments. There are a lot of original letters that Roger sent back to his family in Nantes in France. But there are also letters that were collected and someone did a translation and typed the translation. And some of those are the only ones that are available. So forgive me because this is not going to look glamorous or romantic or anything like that. But this is what we have to deal with. So this is a letter that was written from New Orleans in 1821. So remember, Roger's down there, meets with Audubon on Christmas Eve. He's in New Orleans on business. And a few days later, on the 18th of January in 1822, he writes to his brother back in France. So these are some excerpts that are pretty good. He's writing to Nantes, and that's the town in France where he was from and where his family still was. My business has brought me to this city for a short while, and I am profiting by the opportunity of a ship sailing for Havre to send you my news. So he's referring to Le Havre. We would say Le Havre, but it was going from New Orleans all across the way. I have also given him, meaning the ship's captain, I've also given him my portrait and that of my wife, which I have asked him to send to you by a ship that will be going to your neighborhood. So our mind immediately jumps right over there to the portraits of Roger and his wife. He now says, calls about his family a bit. He said, I left my wife in good health and I hope to be in the bosom of my family in a few weeks, meaning back here in St. Genevieve. I hope that you, your wife, and he goes on to say, are well. Okay, so the final thing is, he says, they will procure for me the pleasure of hearing from you. If my wife were here, she would send you her wishes for your happiness as for me. Mark well that I am still living in St. Genevieve, Missouri Territory. Adieu, good health, and remember me to all the family and give them my respectful sentiments. So he's writing back to his brother. His mother, I believe, is still alive, but just for a very short amount of time further. So this is the beginning of this next kind of convolution of mystery. This obviously means they didn't have a Polaroid to send. So the way that Ferdinand could communicate that he was married, other than in a letter, was to send portraits. It seems like a mighty big thing for us to do, but it's not at all uncommon that people would send this pair of portraits back to his family to have them know. And in fact, there's another letter regarding this. It's from Ferdinand Roger's sister, the mother of Firmin Deloge. And she writes back to Firmin after she's seen the portraits. And this is by 1823. She said, I've seen the two portraits he sent us. I could easily recognize my brother's features, but I think the painter has made him too old. And she also says, his wife's face predisposes us in her favor. So I think she's complimenting him. He writes several other letters. He's so proud to tell his mother that he has some kids. And in French, I can't think what the exact words is, but she says, she has given me a big fat baby for one of their first kids. So this is a momentary time that they intercepted again in New Orleans. Audubon's next move, with his wife in mind, because she's down there, is up to another plantation area in Mississippi at this time, and Louisiana. And so Lucy Audubon ends up getting a job up there. And she meets a woman who's running a plantation, and the woman has an idea to start a school. So Lucy agrees to teach for this school. So they head up to Natchez, Mississippi. Coincidentally, this painting, this panorama of Natchez was done by Audubon. The crazy thing is, you know, when I look at this and I have in my mind that panoramic painting of St. Genevieve, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, these are really in the same genre, they're similar. We do know that the painting here in St. Genevieve was much later, though, because it has telegraph poles in that painting, and the telegraph doesn't start here, I think, till about 1849, so it's way past this time period. But it's funny how they're consistent in the style. So Audubon goes up to Natchez as well. He's been there many times before, several times before. And this time he makes the acquaintance of two young gentlemen, the Wales brothers, Benjamin L.C. Wales and Edmund Wales. Benjamin is kind of an amateur naturalist, so they get along very well. The two brothers take Audubon hunting multiple times. They have a fantastic plantation there as well, and so they get to be good friends. And in fact, he also becomes friends with these two boys, their parents, Levin Wales and Eleanor Davis Wales. Levin Wales does a big favor for Audubon and gets him another job. Audubon went up ostensibly to teach at the Elizabeth Women's Academy there. He did for a time, but he caught yellow fever, and he was very sick, and he had to quit that job. He recovered from that eventually, but then this gentleman helped. The second job was at the academy just in Natchez. So they were very helpful in his cause. But the family, I think, probably knew that Audubon needed some funds. They commissioned 4 of these sketch portraits. So they survive. This is probably a little summary of what went on in Natchez at the time, because this is a pivotal point, I think, in Audubon's art history life as well. Audubon runs across a gentleman who's an itinerant portraitist. And those guys were not terribly uncommon, and they made their living doing a lot of what Audubon had done. They moved to an area, advertised, and the 4 or 5 wealthy families which can afford a portrait get their portraits done. He cleans that, and he has to move to a new place that has people who have enough funds to do that. So he met John Steen, who was doing the very same thing. And he also mentions in his journal, he says, he, meaning Steen, gave me the first lesson in painting in oils I ever took in my life. So that's how it gets started. The two gentlemen decide they're going to form a little bit of a working arrangement. They publish something in the newspaper, the Mississippi Gazette, that says this: Messrs. Audubon and Steen were advertising for their services in the Mississippi State Gazette as portrait painters. $50 for a full-size portrait and $30 for a miniature. So actually one of Audubon's sons and Steen and Audubon set out to do this and kind of get into that market, because Audubon was convinced by Steen and a couple other people that there was much more money to be made in oil portraits than in the sketches that he was doing. So he kind of makes a shift in his course to accommodate something he thought would be financially more profitable. The plantation where his wife had gone, Lucy had gone to work, was called Beech Woods. So they are out on wagonback or horseback, I assume. Something must not go real well between Audubon and Steen. There's some kind of a disagreement. By the time they reach Beech Woods plantation where she was working, Steen goes his way and Audubon stays there for a little bit with her. So they never really make this full-fledged partnership to do paintings together. What I want to show you next is some things from this phase of Audubon's art. This is his son, his oldest son. And in doing this, I felt the need to go to Henderson, Kentucky. And so some good friends of mine said, yes, you absolutely have to go. And I took that advice and I went. And boy, am I glad I did. It's really a lovely facility, well done, nice museum, you know, elephant portfolio, prints of the birds of America. It's a marvelous thing. But they have the original portraits of Audubon's sons. And like I wanted to tell you, explain seeing the originals of the Rogers and the original of the portrait of Jean-Baptiste Bozier at Nelson Atkins in Kansas City. To see those originals was a moving experience. And I don't know if I can adequately describe it to you, but I recommend the experience of seeing them originally. What I can say is they're quite small. They're, you know, when you're seeing stuff on a PowerPoint, everything looks big, and these paintings are actually fairly small, but they're beautifully executed, and I do mean beautifully executed. And the thing that I came away feeling was this man loved his kids. There's something in the faces, in the eyes. You can tell that this is a man who loved and revered his kids because they're so beautifully done. This is the elder son. He was about 14 at the time. And the younger son is even cuter. He's named after his dad. So those two marvelous portraits. But this is the beginning of this oil painting period. And I suspect that, well, he was trying to perfect his portraiture skills in oil. He was looking for likely subjects. His sons obviously fit that bill. And this is another. They had a daughter, a child who died as an infant. She was only, I think, about 2 years old. She passed away while they were in Henderson, Kentucky. And so this was painted after her passing. So this is posthumous painting. This is in the collection, too, the original, at the Henderson Museum. And it's quite lovely. I have a couple questions about whether really it was done by Audubon. It's certainly attributed to him, and they are very much convinced of it there. So I'm not casting any dispersions on it, but it doesn't fit some of the other things I'm seeing in it. It's a little bit larger. It ends up being about that big, but it's a beautiful piece. And so it was painted, by Audubon in memory of his daughter. It's called, the painting they call Miss Audubon. And another likely subject when he was perfecting some of those skills was himself. So this is the self-portrait. As far as I know, and maybe you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, this painting is not in a museum. It's still in a private collection. So those Audubon jewels are still out there. But again, you can see he's gone to this more three-quarter view for portraiture. And you can see a lot of detail in and amongst his collar, the cravat, the coat, the vest, part of that. They also, on this journey out of Natchez, came upon a family at a fairly nice place. This is Asphodel Plantation. I tried to find these paintings. There are 4 of them, supposedly, of the Fluker family. This is David Fluker. He's the only one I could find in oil, or in color, and it's because that painting has been separated from the other 3 and sold off a couple different times, so it's on an auction website. But this is a photograph of their house from the 1930s, but it was quite a plantation house. Anyway, these other three were very hard to track down, but these are the two sons, David Jones Fluker and John Fluker, and late at night I was trying to piece this together in my mind. I don't think I succeeded, but I think David Jones Fluker here is actually in the other portrait I showed you. I think that's him grown up. I don't think that's his father. I think that's him grown up. And this is definitely his mother on the far right. So once again, two sons with one of their parents. So it's kind of follows the thing. But again, some detail around here and things like that. It's very hard to tell from this reproduction much about these paintings. But we do know the size, which is helpful in studying the next thing. So the next big question is, could Audubon possibly have been the artist who created these portraits? My thought on it is no, despite how much we would want that to be the case, I cannot find in the letters and in the records a time when those two gentlemen again would have been in each other's company for long enough to create portraits like these. Sketches, that can be a much faster process, but an oil painting is not something that happens overnight, as you all know. When you see these in person, we're at a disadvantage because these paintings have never, ever been cleaned. And I think people from the Art Guild maybe ought to march up to the Art Museum and say, we're going to help you and write you a check, but we want a conservator to clean these paintings. I think we may see a lot of things in the painting after cleaning that we don't see today. It's just a thought on it. I'm willing to be, have my mind changed, but I just feel as though there are several factors. The timing factor probably is not real conducive for them to be together to make these portraits painted. And the other factor is I don't know of an occasion when Audubon would have come in contact with Mrs. Rozier herself in person. They met each other at different times in their life, but purely on like a social occasion as opposed to spend a week or so together. Anyway, it doesn't diminish from the portraits, I want to add. The other thing that struck me in looking at these, because I was hampered by these little black and white images that don't do us a whole lot of good either with style or things, but they're very good about indicating the size of the paintings. So I tried to do a little work and put those paintings back into the right scale to compare them with each other. So here are the paintings of the two sons, and they're about 8 by 11. And this is just a little larger, around 12 inches tall. And his self-portrait is the same size as the other three portraits of the Flukers. But in the background, I put in Ferdinand Rozier's portrait in ratio. So that's how big it is compared. I think when he was maybe doing these, a small painting is still very valuable and maybe a little quicker to execute if you're on the road to do that as well. So it's just a thought, but I think we have to be able to look at a broad spectrum of things to identify paintings. And by no means do I claim to be an expert in identifying Audubon paintings. I'm just going by what a lot of I've read and some of these other factors that we can take a look at. At the Audubon Museum in Henderson, they also have a number of other paintings there that are, they say they are attributed to Audubon. And so attribution gets a lot. And so these are two paintings up above that were created about the same time that Audubon was working in oil in Mississippi in the 1820s. They're of the Muntz, Mr. and Mrs. Muntz, about 1823. And these down here are much, much later, and they were created in 1843. And this gentleman was named Culbertson, and he had a Native American wife. And the claim is that these paintings were made by Audubon kind of on one of his last journeys, and his eyesight was failing, and that these would have been the last paintings that he created. There are a couple other portraits in the Audubon Museum in Henderson which really caused me, consternation, I guess. And it's the two portraits up above. Those were supposedly painted by Audubon while he was in Henderson in 1819 in oil. These images here that you see are not the best, but the paintings are also, they don't give me the same sense of quality of draftsmanship to draw the figures, and they certainly don't give me any indication of the same brush work or skill in the actual painting part of it. I think that may be an overzealous attribution of Audubon to those two portraits. And then the one which is probably the strangest is the portrait of Daniel Boone that's in their collection. And they explained to me that Audubon was a great big fan of Daniel Boone, and so they don't believe, they met once, but just for a short time, but they think that Audubon created this painting kind of as a tribute to this larger-than-life figure, Daniel Boone. It's in their collection. To me, I don't know, it doesn't strike me as anything like the actual Audubon ones of his son. It's a nice painting. It's an interesting story. I'm not positive, but believe me, I don't know. Anyway, let's go back. We're going to go back up to 2022. Where am I? So, I'm still at the Missouri Historical Society in the reading room, and I've got these letters spread out for me, and I'm thinking, well, these portraits we know went to France. His sister comments on them. She was in France, and he sent them with a ship captain to get them over to France. Okay. That seems fine and logical. But, now wait a second. I'm looking at the portraits in the basement of the Missouri Historical Society. The ones in the letters. Or are they the ones in the letters? Are there more than one set of portraits of the Rogers? I had to go to the Missouri Historical Society, actually a total of 3 times, but twice, because I woke up back in my bed, and you know how at night your brain works probably better in the daytime? I'm thinking, well, how could that be? That these are different portraits? Are they the same portraits? What's going on? And I thought, thinking about those great letters from Roger, beautiful handwriting, blah, blah, blah. You turn the letter over and you see he's addressed it to his brother in Nantes, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, now wait a second. This actual letter I have in my hand is the one he wrote, and it went to France. This letter went to France. This letter was in his mother's hand, his brother's hand, in France. How do I now have this letter in my hand in St. Louis, Missouri? Another big question. So I toddled off to the curator and said, please, can you help me and tell me where the society got these manuscript collections? She said, well, yes, there are 4 places. She wrote them down, blah, 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 blah. Well, the one that had donated the biggest volume was a lady named Mrs. Dietrich. All the record said is Mrs. Dietrich, and that was it. I thought, who is Mrs. Dietrich? I have no earthly idea who is Mrs. Dietrich. So I went back to her, and this time they're very nice up there and patient with me. She said, well, I don't know who Mrs. Dietrich is. This was in 1979, but I'll look it up. So she did. She comes out with a piece of paper, which is this on the right-hand side. Up at the top, it just says Mrs. Dietrich, gives her address in St. Louis, and all these, I think there's 29 separate letters, journals, entries, different things that were in this collection. So I thought, who is Mrs. Dietrich? I got to know. So you start Googling it. That came up with a big round 0. So I said, if this were 1979, I would get out the phone book. But you can't get out the phone book anymore. But if you call the St. Louis Public Library, they will get out the phone book for you. I said, do you have a phone book from 1979? And she said, no, we don't. We have one from 1980. I said, that'll be fine. She looked it up. Not only did they have the lady's name spelled incorrectly, because it's not D-E-I-T-R-I-C-H, it's D-E-A-T-R-I-C-K. There's her name, Marion, her husband's name. They're retired, and they live at Loran Avenue. Well, they don't live there anymore. I start Googling stuff. Lo and behold, they moved to California too. And I believe they're both, the husband and wife are both deceased, but they have a son, and he's only 70-some years old. I wrote him a letter 2 weeks ago. I just got it returned to sender a couple days ago. I'm afraid it's a little bit of a dead end because there's no such person and no forwarding address and stuff like that. So my next step is actually to contact, the people who wrote the book called Between the Gabourey. It was Mary Rozier Sharp. She had been the queen of the Bicentennial Ball. Her husband, Mr. Sharp, wrote the genealogy and the history of all the Roziers. I looked it up in there. They're not Roziers. But I thought I need to speak to their son. I know them both. I haven't talked to them in years. And ask him if this name sounds familiar, because very curiously, the documents came to the Missouri Historical Society in 1979. Mr. and Mrs. Rozier published that history of the family in 1981. I suspect something happened and someone said, hey, look at all these documents that the society just has acquired about the Roziers, and that set off some chain of events in their mind to start them writing this thing. So I'm just wondering if somehow, maybe in their papers or something, they don't have some mention of who this Mrs. Dietrich was. The Roziers, in my experience, have been protective enough of their family history and protective enough of their houses and legacies. I can't imagine that they would have sold these things at a garage sale somehow. But somehow, I'm dying to know, how did Mrs. Dietrich get those documents? But thank God, she sold them for $2,000 to the Missouri Historical Society. I'd say they were worth $2,000 plus. Anyway, I want to leave with our good friends Constance and Ferdinand Rozier, and enjoy those portraits here, because it's fitting that we get to experience a little bit about their life, and I think that's a big part. And now, a little bit of an end to our story today. Both gentlemen lived to pretty good age. On the left, of course, is Audubon. He died, I believe, in about 1854, something like that. They had gotten together before in the 1840s, and Rozier visited him at his estate on the Hudson River, and they had quite a lovely reunion in the 1840s. And Rozier himself lived to be an even older gentleman. He died in 1864 right here in St. Genevieve. So, quite a tale those two guys have together, quite intertwined. But anyway, thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
Can I put in a plug that tonight
Yes.
at Valley Auditorium, you'll get to see the Audubon Rozier saga in a musical form.
Come to life.
And come to life, and it's a lot of fun. So anyhow, it's tonight at 7.
And tomorrow
and
at...
tomorrow at 4.
Perfect. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. Thank you. Yes, Carolyn.
Do you have any thoughts on if possibly it wasn't Audubon that painted those portraits, who it might have been? Any other candidates? He was the most well-known in the area at the time.
Right. Well, I think what we don't have a great handle on, but I do have a nice example, is that these itinerant artists, I think they made their way through the country. I don't know if they had a route, but they did that. We have in the Felix Valley House a microfilm copy of a letter that Felix Vallée wrote to Pierre Menard over on the other side of the river. And he said, if you are looking to get your portrait painted, you should do it now because the artist is here painting Mama and Papa right now. That was in about 1837, if my brain is charging on all cylinders. So I think we have a copy of those two. We have those two portraits in the house. And I believe Menard did go ahead and have his portrait painted because he wanted to give a portrait of himself to the girls' school. I apologize, I can't remember the name of the school over there, which was in Kaskaskia, a religious girls' school. He had been a big benefactor, and they wanted to have a portrait of him at the school. And I think that's when he had that painting done. It used to hang over the mantel in the Menard house, and it's remarkably similar in the background color and tone. So I think, Carolyn, that it would certainly be a great process or project to do a little more scouring for letters or references or anything like that for artists who made their way through on kind of an itinerant basis. I think we have enough portraits in town now that I think that would be a great benefit to us. Oh, okay. I'll talk to you next week. All right, well, you guys have a great afternoon. Thank you for being so patient. I apologize. We kind of went over time, but I don't get to talk to people very often, and I don't know to shut up. All right, thanks, everybody. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.